Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. Today we have with us again our friend Matthias von Hein speaking to us today from Bonn in Germany. And, today we're going to talk about the idea that sometimes when you least expect it, the most positive things in the world can happen. And we were just discussing before we went on air today the monumental changes that happened out of the blue in Europe in 1989, 1990, when what seemed to be the impermeable, the permanent feature of that continent since the end of the Second World War in 1945, the Iron Curtain, and also the Berlin Wall, came tumbling down in very quick succession, out of the blue, unexpectedly, with extraordinarily diverse and mostly positive consequences that came afterwards. But none of us could have predicted it. None of us knew that it was going to happen. And yet, out of the blue, that thing that seemed permanent suddenly was no longer. Same thing happened just a few short years later with the ending of apartheid in South Africa, a feature of that horrible, heinous regime that ran South Africa from 1913 until 1994, the apartheid, racist, horrible regime, against which huge international boycotts were carried out. Country after country refused to continue to collaborate with South Africa as time went on, as they understood the depth and the horrible human consequences of the racial discrimination advocated by the white regime there. The occupation of East Timor, which also seemed permanent and seemingly going to last forever, ended in 1999, also out of the blue. And we could name countless political developments that happened, very much in our lifetime, many of which we had something directly to do with in one way, shape, or form, which happened out of the blue. But they were always preceded by something else. They were preceded by popular movements. They were preceded by negotiations, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes very openly, that led eventually to a brand new emergence of a brand new era. And that's something that this channel, Democracy Tomorrow, is really all about stimulating when it comes to the question of our shared humanity on our shared planet, with our vision being one that we need to expedite the step towards the next stage of our human political evolution, not in the direction of nationalism or authoritarianism or us versus them or our superiority versus the inferiority of others. None of those things, but rather the simple fact, which all of us know in our heart of hearts, that we share 99% of the same DNA. We are all human beings with the same needs and wishes, notwithstanding whatever minor differences may exist, and that it is in our collective advantage to unify infinitely more than it is to divide. The more we come together, the more we agree to a shared set of values and rules, such as already exist in the form of international law and human rights law and things of that nature. And the further that we go to enforce those things and create a playing field in which all of us can participate as equals, the world will become more peaceful, more prosperous, ultimately with fewer human rights violations, and hopefully with no poverty at all. We have made tremendous progress as a species in the last 80 years, and certainly since our existence as humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. But we're at a real critical juncture in history, it feels like now, with anybody opening the paper of today or yesterday or tomorrow, seeing countless stories that appear to show that somehow everything is falling apart and everything is going in a bad direction. And yes, we totally acknowledge these things. We don't ignore them whatsoever. But we have to remind people, and even remind ourselves sometimes, that the overwhelming majority of the species of which we are all a part, the human race, are not engaged in these types of horrible crimes and horrible activities. The vast majority of people in the vast majority of places just want to get along with their lives and live a peaceful, safe, and secure, and hopefully prosperous and healthy life. That is the reality of today. But we think there's really a need to push things a little bit further and use this year, 2025, the year that we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the United Nations Charter, a charter which was designed to end war forevermore on the heels of that horrible war that struck the world from 1939 to 1945. Many, many people across the world appear to be losing any sort of reflection capacity when it comes to examining history and the consequences of the types of movements that emerged prior to World War II that ended in carnage. And the list of countries, the list of regions that have pursued similar policies throughout the recent history and certainly the distant past always end in the very same way. And that's something that we really should bear in mind. So we want to look forward. We want to keep proposing, as we will in the weeks and years and months and years to come, concrete and practical ways by which we can facilitate greater understanding and greater unity amongst people all across the world. There's so many of us. There's millions upon millions of us who already know these things intuitively and inherently, and who are friends with people from across the world, and for whom racism and hatred of religion and all of those other things are not part of our makeup whatsoever. We see humans as humans. And we believe that the way we move forward best and we secure the longevity of our irreplaceable species is through this process of unifying. So in these difficult days, I'll just give one example. There's been a lot of really horrible rhetoric in Australia in the last 2 weeks from some extreme right-wing commentators and people against immigration in a country that is completely built on the basis of immigration. And so, those are opportunities for those who see immigration and the people involved in the process from all around the world that have made Australia such a better country than it was before the immigration occurred, to speak about that and to actually, when you meet someone who is an immigrant, make them doubly welcome than you would have made them the day before. And tell them how happy you are that they're here. And greet them and say hello and say, we're so glad that you're here. You make the country so much better. And all of us can do things like that in our own countries, in our own places, all across the world, every single day. So rather than digging our heads into the sand, rather than expressing exclusively despair and hopelessness, let's remember the inherent goodness of our species. And let's, in whatever way we possibly can, from the smallest, most minor acts of just being kind to people and to everything else we can do, to push things in that direction of improved relations, collaboration, cooperation, so that we together can build a planet which is in fact infinitely greater than the planet we've already built, which is already pretty good. So that's my message today. How about you, Matthias? What's your message for viewers?
Well, first a comment, just because it just popped up in my mind when you were talking about immigration in Australia. I'm not exactly sure whether the Aboriginals would agree that immigration made Australia a better place. Probably not for them. But I think you mentioned the end of the Second World War and 80 years ago, and the sudden changes that come around, and we are recording this on the 12th of September 2025, and it is on this day 35 years ago that the Second World War ended formally in Europe, and that was by signing the so-called 2+4 treaty in Moscow. Two were East Germany and West Germany, German Democratic Republic and Federal Republic of Germany, plus Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States as the victor powers of the Second World War. And it was this agreement that paved the way for the formal reunification of Germany. Something that, even a year earlier, for me, had been utterly unthinkable. I've been living in Berlin, in the summer of '89, and there was no sign whatsoever that the wall would crumble in November '89. I grew up seeing, this division, actually the most fortified border in the world, maybe apart from the, inner Korean border. And for me, this was just a fact of life, and I didn't even question it. I had totally accepted it. I lived with it. I crossed it with difficulties. There were searches and all. Whenever going to and from Berlin. But it, I would have never thought that this war would fall, that there would be a reunification. And on this day, 35 years ago, there was a formal treaty, and the war ended, and post-war Europe emerged, and it was such a great time of hope and of forward looking. And basically the politicians at the time were overwhelmed themselves with a pace of positive developments. At the time, we had major conferences, for instance, in Paris, the Paris agreements. There was talk about building a common sphere of security from Lisbon to Vladivostok, basically covering the whole of the Eurasian landmass minus China. And that was not a pipe dream, actually. There are many reasons why one could go and look at history, why it hasn't evolved in that way. We don't do this today, but this podcast today is to remember those moments and also what led to that. And in my eyes, it is, as you said, it is looking eye to eye, even with enemies, and maybe recognizing that enemies are maybe not enemies, they may be just opponents, and you have sometimes maybe to put yourself in their shoes, try to understand motives, trying to de-escalate and not escalate, trying to trying to at least the minimum thing is understanding rhetoric and being very critical, when viewing media, when scrolling through our timelines, to be very critical and to be sort of vigilant and try to detect when there are messages that dehumanize others. This is, whenever there's dehumanization happening, that well has been poisoned. Don't drink from that well. Don't do that. Whenever whoever it is, but whenever whenever there is, hate, whenever there's, talk about, total victory, that, or, destruction, we must totally destruct this, totally destruct that. That's always, in my mind, a very dangerous path. We have to disarm, basically. And there's this sort of wonder in 1990. It didn't happen out of thin air. There were a lot of events leading to that, a lot of controversial events. For instance, here in Germany, the policy of reaching out to Eastern Europe, followed in the 60s and 70s by the Social Democrats here, most famously Willy Brandt, and their trips to Russia or to the Soviet Union, which was still existent at the time. They're reaching out, they're setting up conference and consultations mechanisms like the so-called Helsinki process. Um, so this is all for the younger viewers. This is all vocabulary you might have never heard of, but it's well worth Googling it or asking your AI chatbot, what the Helsinki process is, or the OSZE, thing that set in motion a lot of very positive changes. And these at the time, the United States, for instance, wasn't very happy with this Eastern policy of Willy Brandt, and it was very there was a lot of political dispute in Germany. He was attacked very harshly by the Christian Democrats at the time, but finally, this policy was a major stepping stone over time to overcome the division, to actually be able to talk to one another, to build trust, because, trust is the currency that is, very much in demand. And it takes a lot of time to build trust, and it is so easy to destroy.
Very true. Very, very true. So, in terms of sort of concrete things that, just building upon what you just said, concrete things that can be done to push things in a better direction than we're going in now. I'll just mention two things that we're actually doing. So one thing is we're designing right now a course which is going to last a year, um, tentatively called Earthling, a course on world citizenship, which is going to be held over 26 sessions online, to sort of work through, for whoever wants to participate in this, what it actually means to be a world citizen and how to get there, practically, politically, but also really psychologically. So half of the course will be run by a guy called Nigel Denning, who was one of the guests in an earlier episode, who's an expert on integrative psychology, trained psychologist, on what are the mental sort of psychological blockages that so many people have in embracing the rest of humanity, and the role that collective trauma plays in preventing us from reaching beyond our borders and things of that nature. I'll be doing more stuff on the political, practical, sort of human rights side, and there'll be some other people involved as well. So that's one of the concrete things that we're going to be doing over the next year or two, maybe longer if we're lucky. And then the other thing is we're drafting now. It's already in its like 10th or 15th version, but we're drafting sort of a generic resolution or a motion that our goal is, a very small goal. Every single city council in the world or local government body in the world, unanimously, preferably, approves this resolution that we're about to release to the public, tentatively called Achieving World Citizenship for Everyone, Everywhere, which outlines a few sort of, background statements about why this is something that we will support, and then practical steps that each local government that approves the resolution agrees to undertake to concretize world citizenship. So not just the esoteric ideal, which has been around since Socrates and beyond, but to actually concretize a formal legal status that can be established at a local or national level that confers jointly with your pre-existing nationality a world citizenship status. Also, the resolution says if we do this and government, let's say a government in Melbourne, Australia, adopts the resolution, they also agree to recognize anything that a government in, let's say, Moscow does under the auspices of the same resolution. So if they issue a world citizenship status in Melbourne and the Moscow municipality does the same thing, the government of Melbourne agrees to recognize the world citizenship status conferred upon residents under the jurisdiction of Moscow's local government initiative, and all others. So, that's a longer term ongoing process, but it's our one of our many efforts to sort of concretize what has always been a very esoteric, very pie in the sky, sort of hopeful dream into the real political and legal fabric of the world today, which is combined with another initiative of ours, creating a new legal doctrine called not just soli or just sanguinis, which are the basic forms of citizenship in the world in legal terms, but a new status called just Gaia, which is basically a citizenship based upon our membership of humanity as opposed to membership of a family or of a nation state. So, we're pushing, on those two fronts and many others to push things forward. But, again, to reiterate, today's the 35th anniversary of a very significant agreement, which no one saw coming in the decades prior to that. Both Matthias and I lived in Europe during most of the 1980s and 1990s for me, and then I was gone. But he still lives there. But we saw the Berlin Wall all the time. I used to go to Berlin constantly when I lived in Holland and Germany. It was a regular destination, and it was so intense. I mean, it's almost impossible to, confer how intense it was. And it was this given thing at the time. It was guaranteed that there was going to be this wall between people forever, because some people wanted to build a wall and stop, interaction between the countries. And the amount of security and the amount of harassment and the kind of fear that was always present, especially when you were in, for me, the most exciting thing was, of course, taking the train from Holland through Germany, West Germany. That was fine. And then all of a sudden you cross the East German border. It was all these East German guards and stuff coming on the train. And then you were in the train in East Germany for a few hours before you finally reached the so-called West again, when you reached West Berlin. And that contrast between Western Europe and then Eastern Germany and then Berlin again was just amazing. This little island of democracy in the middle of, this, whatever you want to call it, communist regime or Soviet satellite state. And then it all came apart. All the cards came tumbling down when we least expected it. And so there's always hope that no matter how bad things may appear, that very often a lot of these things are indeed built like castles on sand and houses of cards. They're not nearly as stable or permanent as they would want you to think. And so, that's the message for today, that do not give up hope. Do not think that all is lost. Do not think that only, dark and gloomy days are coming. There are so many positive things happening in the world, and they don't make the headlines. They almost never do. If it bleeds, it leads. It's still the credo of most media outlets in the world. It has to bleed and then it's going to lead. And yes, it's horrible, all those things that are on the front pages, but there are millions and millions of other things which are really great. Just basic internet, interactions between humans across the world every single day by the billions, which are pleasant and kind and nice. And, let's build on that and see, where we can go in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, lots of positive things happening, even, if the mega trend seems to be so devastating. But like yesterday, I've been to a small exhibition here in Bonn, about future cities, and there's so many interesting developments. That's just a small segment, but it's important, like, a lot of the smartest minds, think about how to make, the cities in the world more livable, in a warming environment, how to create spaces, where people can get together and they are cool all by themselves, because they are shaded by plants and, interesting or intelligent use of materials, so that cities are not that much resource gobbling entities, but rather places basically for people to live and thrive, and not so much for companies to maximize profits. And these things are happening and they're gaining traction too. So, yeah, as the saying goes, think globally, act locally, do what you can, in your field of uh, vision, or where you have influence, and yeah, and try to stick to yourself, and don't let yourself be so distracted by the bombardment of information and disinformation. I think we need to we do need some kind of mental hygiene, which doesn't mean, as you said, it doesn't mean to block out, the front pages, but it means to put stuff in perspective, and uh, build resilience, not to be overwhelmed, but to uh, retain some retain some resilience, and some feeling of no, I can do something, and I'm basically, the thing is, if you if you're already at the point where you say, I want to be part of the solution and don't want to be part of the problem, and that's my compass, then I think that's already a lot.
Well, and I think people also can ask themselves, what if I viewed the world without any fear? What if I truly had no fear? How would I view the world differently? And because I think so much of the things that are going on today are really, really ultimately at their source based upon some deep seated fear and unresolved trauma, and it might be collective trauma. But it sort of boils down to that. I mean, the world that we get is our collective consciousness times 8.2 billion people, and that's the world we get. So if those consciousnesses are driven by fear and sort of animal instincts and bloodlust and things of that nature, that's the world we're going to get. But if our minds are driven by love and care and compassion and kindness and friendliness and fun and dancing and music and great food and good vibes, well, then we'll have a very different world as well. So, and there's a plenty of people out there that have their minds directed in those positive directions, and we need to find ways to, accentuate those and really essentially draw on our, higher selves. Oh, and by the way, just to respond to your indigenous question, yes, at one level, that's 1 trillion% true. And I remind everybody that I am speaking from land of the Bunurong people who have lived on this land and held this land for tens of thousands of years. For those who don't know, the Aboriginal culture in Australia is the oldest human culture on Earth. Over 65,000 years of continuous culture in place on this continent. And, this is also a very positive thing. Of course, there are light years to go before any sense of complete and comprehensive justice is provided to Indigenous people. The very first international law meeting I ever went to in the world, in like the first career thing, was about the revision of the only existing treaty at the time on Indigenous populations, as they were then called. It was the revision of International Labor Organization Convention number 107 back in 1986. The light years of advancement that has come since 1986 till now in terms of the recognition of Indigenous rights, how well organized they are, how many mechanisms they have set up, how many laws and declarations have been adopted, is astronomical. And so much so that this very week, I mean, we should do a whole podcast on this very week, just 2 days ago, I think, the very first treaty between Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples in the state of Victoria, where I'm broadcasting from, and the state government of Victoria was concluded. There's no other treaty in Australia. There's certainly no national treaty which has full-scale recognition of the rights of the original inhabitants of Victoria. It's a monumental step forward. And so, every public event in Australia begins with a welcome to country, reaffirming the land on which the meeting has taken place. And there have been public apologies made at the parliament level. There have been countless commissions established, rules, laws, regulations, programs designed to remedy the crimes of the past against the Indigenous peoples of Australia. And the slogan, always was, always will be, is one that you see everywhere in Australia in reference to the land and the land rights held by Indigenous peoples here. And so it's a very real and very alive and continually evolving issue. And the conclusion of this treaty is truly historic. I mean, it's truly something that the rest of the world will start looking to soon. It is amazing that they were able to get this through. And we'll see how it plays out in the real world, because it's very much of an uphill battle, but it's a very real and very alive issue here, So it's just something to remember. It's another area where you can show, yes, there's huge problems that are unresolved, but overall there has been, massive progress in terms of recognition and things of that nature. And we need to do that on sort of every issue, throughout the world. So I think with that, unless you have anything else you want to say, Matthias, thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll see you again next week, hopefully, Matthias, and we'll see everybody else soon. We have several very exciting new episodes coming up in the next week or two. This is Democracy Tomorrow, the World Citizen podcast. If you like what we say, or you find it interesting at least, please subscribe and like. And if you have any ideas about things and issues we can address in upcoming episodes, let us know in the comments below. And other than that, have a great day, everybody, and be kind. See you soon.